Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 145, The Life of Jonson, Part 3. There is no greater hell than to be a prisoner of fear. Last time, I took you through Jonson's early life and education, and had just got to the point where he turned from bricklaying and soldiering to the theatre. But Jonson's career as a playwright almost came to a complete stop before it got properly started. In fact, London theatre itself was almost completely wiped off the map, thanks to the events that Jonson was instrumental in. A lesser man would have been completely floored and retreated from public view very quickly, but fortunately Jonson was made of sterner stuff than that. If the title of the play, The Isle of Dogs, sounds familiar, it's because I've mentioned these events before in relation to Thomas Nashe, and generally as a significant event in the trajectory of Elizabethan theatre. Subscribers on Patreon have also heard the core of this episode, as I covered these events as part of a series of episodes that looked in detail at some of the contents of Henslow's diary. But there is more here now, and I'm telling you this story through the prism of Ben Jonson's career. So to pick up from last time, this is where Jonson has played with Pembroke's men and has also written a play, or maybe two, for them. Returning from touring, the players took up an offer from Francis Langley to rent the Swan Theatre from him for a year. Jonson was a sharer in that deal with other members of the company. He then got together with the already well-established Thomas Nashe to create a new satiric piece for the company. Unfortunately, events at the Swan are not recorded. We have no Henslow's diary for the Swan as we do for the Rose, so this has been pieced together from fragmentary evidence and the records of the Privy Council. What we can say is that in the last week of July of 1597, the new play, The Isle of Dogs, was performed at the Swan. Almost immediately, on the 28th of July, the Privy Council issued an order which must have shocked Henslow and the other theatre managers. They were used to orders closing theatres for specific reasons and for a specific time frame. This was part of the hazard of running a theatre, and however unpleasant having to close your theatre for a period was, it was just part of the arena that they operated in. But this order was of a different magnitude. It was issued to the Justices of Middlesex, the local judicial body who enforced the council's orders in the county where the theatres were located, just outside London's city walls. The tone of this announcement was different from any of its predecessors. This one did not cite a concern for public health, or even directly for the safekeeping of public morals, and its seriousness was reinforced as it directly mentioned the Queen's concern. That concern was because she and her council had become aware of very many great disorders committed in the common playhouses, both by lewd matters that are handled on the stages and by resort and confluence of bad people. The order stated that there were to be no more plays performed in any public place within 3 miles of the city until All Hallows Tide next. All Hallows Tide being the day before All Souls' Day, so the 31st of October. And the order saved the worst until the last. The council ordered of the magistrates that you do send for the owners of the curtain, the theatre, or any other common playhouse, and enjoin them by virtue hereof forthwith to pluck down quite the stages, galleries, and rooms that are made for people to stand in, and so to deface the same, as they may not be employed again upon such use. It's difficult to imagine what Henslow thought when he read this. No mention of specific players or theatre is made, but in his diary Henslow notes that the restraint is by the means of the playing of the Isle of Dogs. The closure and then the tearing down of the Rose would destroy both his investment and his income stream. With London theatre effectively closed permanently, the less certain and less profitable touring model would be the only option, sending theatre back into the Middle Ages. Henslow and the others were potentially staring complete ruin in the face. But there was some hope. His theatre wasn't mentioned specifically, and we know he had good connections at court, so perhaps, rather than giving up hope, he went quickly to thinking who he knew with influence who might be able to clarify the position for the Rose, or even ensure some outright exemption from the order. It's one of the strange facts of this story that there is no record of any theatre being pulled down or repurposed at this point, and indeed, those who were active simply seem to have picked up again once the summer turned to autumn, and the prohibition on playing elapsed. In fact, Henslow's diary shows that there was activity at the Rose from the 11th of October, when the prohibition should still have been in place. Somehow it was generally understood that this threat was not be carried out, and that it was safe to open the playhouses again. Further, during this time of hiatus, Henslow also records signing up new players for the Lord Admiral's men, suggesting that he had no lack of confidence about the future of London theatre. Some have speculated that the closure of the theatres that summer was just a reaction to the latest round of anti-theatre protests that came and went on a regular basis, which is possible, but it does seem to be a heck of a coincidence, especially when we consider Henslow's comment. Although the order does not mention the Isle of Dogs, the Swan or Pembroke's men specifically, the play, the theatre and those particular players were to find themselves the centre of attention very soon. Richard Topcliffe, Queen Elizabeth's chief interrogator, was made aware of problems at the Swan which he recorded in his letter to the Privy Council dated the 10th of August, when he speaks of the first man that discovered me that seditious play called The Isle of Dogs. The council asked him to investigate further. Word of this must have got out to the players, and anticipating trouble, it's safe to assume that they destroyed any copies of the play, and we know for sure that Nash fled to Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, a remote enough place for him to feel safe from the long arm of the Elizabethan state. His London lodgings were raided, but nothing of consequence was found. Either slightly before this, or somewhat after, Jonson and two players from the company, Robert Shah and Gabriel Spencer, were arrested and brought to the Marshalsea prison. Pembroke's men turned up in Bristol a few days later, so like Nash, we have to assume that they made a prudent exit from the capital, finding some work in the provinces on the assumption that things would cool down soon enough. It was on the 15th of August that the three incarcerated players were taken to Greenwich and examined by the Privy Council, with William Cecil in the lead, but with big hitters like Lord Burleigh, Sir Robert Cecil and Lord Hudson also present. The accusation was one of indulging in lewd and mutinous behaviour containing very seditious and scandalous matter. It is noted in the record that one of the three was not only an actor, but a maker of part of the said play. Now, we assume this means Jonson, but it could perhaps equally have applied to the other players as well. Nash was to protest later that The Isle of Dogs was the unfortunate imperfect embryo of my idle hours, for I having begun but the introduction and first act of it, the other 4 acts without my consent, or the least guess of my drift or scope, by the players was supplied, which bred both their trouble and mine to it. Undoubtedly this is Nash covering his backside after the event in the hope that he could get back to London safely. But there may be some truth in it too, and that the play was a collaboration and quite probably, in part at least, improvised by the players. After the meeting with the Privy Council, the prisoners were again handed to Richard Topcliffe so that they could be interrogated and determine exactly who was responsible for what. As the Privy Council order put it, he was to determine what is become of the rest of their fellows that either had their parts in the devising of that seditious matter, or that were actors or players in the same, what copies they have given forth of the said play and to whom, and such other points as you shall think meet to be determined from them. Although now ageing, Topcliffe was well known as the brutal investigator who had routinely tortured Catholics and prominent prisoners at the behest of the Privy Council. Jonson was lucky that by this time Topcliffe had been ordered to curtail the most excessive of his practices, and he lived to tell the tale. No record exists of what was discovered, apart from Jonson's later proud comment to Drummond that In the time of his close imprisonment under Queen Elizabeth, his judges could get nothing of him to all their demands but aye and no. They placed 2 damned villains to catch advantage of him with him, but he was advised by his keeper. Of the spies he hath an epigram. Although the names of those 2 placed informants are not given, Jonson did later write an epigram. And we will have no poly or parrot by, nor shall our cups make any guilty man, but, at our parting, we will be as when we innocently met. If Jonson is naming the informants here, they were probably the poet Henry Parrot, who was a well-known informer, and just possibly Robert Poley, the same man who is implicated in the death of Christopher Marlowe. Whoever they were, Jonson clearly had no time for them. In another epigram he says, "Spies, you are lights in state, but of base stuff, who, when you've burnt yourselves down to the stuff, stink and are thrown away. End fair enough." And it seems that Jonson's resistance was no boast. On the 2nd of October, the 3 men were released without prosecution. The most likely scenario seems to be that London's theatres, with the exception of the Swan, were allowed to reopen before the end of the summer, through perhaps a quiet word in the right ears rather than an official notice. Perhaps the view was that these errant playwrights and players had been taught enough of a lesson. But the Swan remained closed, and this may not just have been because of the play itself. Francis Langley, the owner of the theatre, had previous form with the Privy Council. Perhaps these actions were at least partly aimed at him in person. Langley was a goldsmith by trade, and had crossed swords with Lord Cecil before over a stolen diamond that Langley had allegedly had a part in trying to sell. The records don't show a resolution in Cecil's case against Langley over that stolen diamond, so it's possible that there was still some bad blood between Cecil and Langley over that matter, and this tricky play was a useful tool for Cecil in an ongoing spat. The closure of his theatre left Langley and Pembroke's men with a problem. Langley may have tried to put on occasional shows during the summer, but likely had little success. Pembroke's men were contracted to the Swan, but unable to perform there, and Langley tried to sue them for breach of contract, but in the end came to a deal with Henslow, who had taken 5 of the company into the Admiral's men. Pembroke's men never recovered, and after a few years' touring they disappear from the record in 1600. Langley died just a year later. So what was the problem with the Isle of Dogs? Unfortunately, the suppression of the play was so successful that we have no idea of its content, so what follows is all speculation. That name comes from an area of London downriver from the city, well known as an area that was a refuge for debtors and small-time criminals. In Elizabethan times, and indeed for a long time afterwards, it was a marshy, boggy place that the river flooded over regularly in its tidal movements. So much so that at times the peninsula became an island temporarily. The word isle was often also used in the description of the whole of the island of Great Britain, in phrases like this sceptred isle. So perhaps the sceptred isle was being portrayed as an island of impoverished and worthless characters, and the realm had been insulted. But it's possible also that the satire in the play was even more personal than that. The Isle of Dogs could have been a jibe at the Palace Placentia, where the Queen kennelled her dogs. This palace was located on the river in Greenwich, between the city and the Isle of Dogs. The palace was a favourite of the Queen's, so was often the location for meetings with the Privy Council. It's hard to think that Nash and Jonson, or any of the other players, would have aimed satire directly at the Queen. That would surely have not been tolerated, and could have led to a charge of treason and certain death. But perhaps the play portrayed the council as her lapdogs and lampooned current members of the council just a bit too closely. That might explain why they felt the need to disrupt theatre so thoroughly, but then stayed their hand by not actually tearing down the theatres. Perhaps the Queen was not directly insulted by the play and rather enjoyed the discomfort of her councillors. The order had made its point, and Cecil could have his revenge on Langley. But for a play-loving queen, perhaps destruction of the theatres was a step too far. It would certainly have been an unpopular move with the population of London, and might have caused some unrest in the city, something that a monarch always had to have their eye on. It is all speculation, but I rather like the idea of Elizabeth reminding her indignant councillors that they should be big enough to rise above these annoyances, and ordering them, perhaps with a little grin, to quietly drop the plans to start the deconstruction of the playhouses. For all the ferocity of the events, they don't appear to have left a deep mark on Jonson, although in his later comedy Eastward Ho! He did set a particularly satiric scene on the Isle of Dogs, which included controversial exchanges about King James and his Scottish favourites. Surely that setting must be Jonson making reference back to his early work. Similarly, John Day called his play of anti-court satire The Isle of Gulls, suggesting that The Isle of Dogs was remembered very well by those in the theatre community. Jonson had, since his arrival in the theatre world, been courting the interest of the Queen in the hope of gaining her sponsorship for his work. He was never successful in this endeavour, with his career only really taking off under James I and Queen Anne. But he did find favour amongst some nobles, perhaps most notably the Earl of Essex. For a while, Jonson was seen as part of his circle, but he managed to distance himself well enough to avoid being caught up in the Earl's final demise. It has been suggested that if Jonson was feeling put out by the Queen's rejection and was happy to pander to Essex and others in his circle who had political ambitions, then perhaps the Isle of Dogs just went a bit too far in personalised satire against the Privy Council and in favour of Essex, to make it politically unacceptable at this point in time. And the play did come out at a difficult time politically, when Essex left the country on an ill-fated expedition to cause the Spanish trouble in the Azores. The theory that the play was of particular interest to Essex and his circle is supported by the one surviving textual reference to the play, which is listed in an index in a manuscript which includes a number of works by Francis Bacon, who was Essex's secretary in the 1590s. The index says that the manuscript includes The Isle of Dogs by Thomas Nash. The pages beyond the index have long since been lost, but the fact that the play was present in the manuscript featuring work by Essex's secretary suggests that it was of interest to Essex and his circle. Jonson clearly fits the mould of a follower of Essex, a man who surrounded himself with articulate, scholarly gentlemen who were not afraid to question the status quo. Perhaps the Isle of Dogs lent a little too favourably towards Essex for the Cecils, who would have been watching his activities closely by then and have been sensitive to the actions of those in his circle. Jonson and Nash could easily have turned powerful figures against them, but as the autumn came on, the threat to theatre was forgotten and Jonson freed from jail. Robert Cecil held back, perhaps seeing in Jonson something more than just an annoyance to be squashed. In time, they would become involved again in the courts and, perhaps more surprisingly, in a relationship that would be very beneficial to the poet and playwright. Despite the issues caused by his latest play, Jonson still found work. In July 1597, Henslow records a payment to him, which may have been an attempt to draw him away from Pembroke's men and to become the staff writer for the Admiral's men. That is recorded on the very same day as the Privy Council issued their order following the first performance of The Isle of Dogs, which may go a long way to explain why Jonson did not make that move to the Rose on a formal basis. But Henslow didn't abandon him, and employed him as a collaborator on an ad hoc basis over the next 2 years. Although there are several records, such as upon a book which he was to write for us before Christmas next, after the date hereforto, which he showed the plot unto the company. Unfortunately, the plays themselves haven't survived, so we'll never know, for example, what Hot Anger Soon Cold, a play that Henslow seems to have made final payments for but was never recorded as being performed, which was written by Jonson with Henry Chettle and Henry Porter, was all about. If we are to believe Francis Mears that by 1598 Jonson was amongst one of the best for tragedy, then there must have been other plays that we now know nothing about from this early period in that genre. There is the scantest of records about a 1599 tragedy he co-wrote with Thomas Dekker. We have just the title, The Lamentable Tragedy of Page of Plymouth. But we can assume that it was a domestic tragedy which was also being retold in ballads at the same time. There was also a Jonson-Dekker history play, Robert II, King of the Scots, for which only the title survives, but presumably a subject for which Jonson had particular interest. Every Man in His Humour, as performed by the Lord Chamberlain's men in September 1598, seems to have been regarded by Jonson himself as the true starting point of his career as a playwright of merit. Probably revised from an earlier version, it is the earliest play that he chose to preserve in his collected works published in 1616. We don't know why the play went to the Lord Chamberlain's men rather than to Henslowe and the Admiral's men, but it's tempting to think that Jonson was keen to be involved with the troupe that was on the rise and enjoying great success with its resident playwright and actor, William Shakespeare. Nicholas Rowe, in his edition of the collected Shakespeare, tells a story of Shakespeare advising Jonson on a script, but the story has no provenance before his telling of it in 1709, so it is probably just editorial fancy. Which doesn't mean that Jonson and Shakespeare never collaborated or advised each other on plays, but we have no evidence of it. However, we do know that the Lord Chamberlain's men performed Jonson's play that year, because it is mentioned in a letter where an audience member reports that a gentleman lost 300 crowns at a new play called Every Man in His Humour. And we know that Shakespeare acted in it because he is listed in the 1616 folio as one of the principal comedians who originally acted it. The play was presumably still making regular appearances in the repertoire of the Lord Chamberlain's men when, on the 22nd of September 1598, Jonson got into a quarrel with actor, playwright and his former collaborator on the Isle of Dogs, Gabriel Spencer. By this time, Spencer was working in the Lord Admiral's men, having left Pembroke's men after his release from prison in the aftermath of the Isle of Dogs affair. Years later, Drummond reported that Jonson said of the matter, "Since his coming to England, being appealed to the fields, he had killed his adversary, which had hurt him in the arm, and whose sword was 10 inches longer than his, for the which he was imprisoned and almost at the gallows." The nature of the argument between Jonson and Spencer is not known, but many have speculated that it may be related to Jonson's lack of loyalty to Henslowe, the Admiral's men, or to Pembroke's men. It could equally have been some personal matter between these two men. Whatever the case, feelings were clearly running high, and, as Jonson tells it, Spencer challenged him to a duel on Hoxton Fields, a rural spot in North London used for military training, recreation, and the illegal, but not uncommon, settling of scores. Henslowe reported the event to Edward Allen, who was away on tour at the time, saying, "I do not forget now to let you understand news, that I will tell you some, but it is for me hard and heavy. Since you were with me, I have lost one of my company, which hurteth me greatly, that is Gabriel, for he is slain in Hoxton Field by the hands of Benjamin Jonson, bricklayer. Therefore, I would fain have a little of your counsel, if I could." I can't help thinking how odd it seems that Henslowe should refer to Jonson here as bricklayer. Jonson had already produced plays by then, some of which Henslowe had paid for. It just suggests that Jonson was not fully accepted as a playwright or a player. But there it is. After the duel, Jonson was immediately taken to Newgate Prison to await trial. While he was there, he was visited by a priest whose words obviously had a deep impact on him. Drummond later reported from their conversations that, "Then took he his religion by trust of a priest who visited him in prison." That priest was Catholic, and the circumstances of Jonson's conversion at this particular time have been much mulled over ever since. Given his family background, it is possible that Jonson had latent Catholic sympathies, And at this moment of extremis, when he was literally staring death in the face, the conversion to the old faith is perhaps understandable. However, many scholars find that doesn't sit well with Jonson's displayed ability for rational argument and debate. In this period of Elizabeth's rule, Catholics were tolerated, but were always under suspicion and could be tortured, imprisoned, and sometimes executed on the slightest of pretexts. At the very least, there were fines to be paid and lip service to the official religion to be enacted. None of this would have made Jonson's life any easier and would have just put up more barriers to his acceptance at court or in obtaining sponsorship from the nobility. Whatever his reasons, Jonson made that conversion and was to remain officially Catholic for the next 12 years. The time for the trial at London's main criminal court, the Old Bailey, soon came, and Jonson faced judge and jury on the charge of manslaughter. The court account says that Jonson feloniously and wilfully struck Spencer with a rapier, killing him instantly with a wound to his right side. He was found guilty of manslaughter, the jury weighing up the eyewitness evidence. Jonson's account to Drummond suggests that he was the one challenged to the duel, but in court it's not quite so clear as to who started the quarrel or who escalated it. Having been found guilty, there was only one effective option open to Jonson to avoid the hangman's noose, and Jonson took it. Translated from Latin, the court record records that he confesses the indictment, asks for the book, reads like a clerk, is marked with the letter T. I have mentioned this technical loophole in the justice system before, but to remind you, it was known as seeing the benefit of the clergy, and originated from a time when the clergy had the right to be tried by the canon law courts, whatever their crime. To prove their clerical credentials, the accused had to read a passage from the Bible. Once confirmed, their case was passed over to the canon court. Over time, this eligibility test was extended to anyone who could read a verse from the Latin Bible. Specifically, Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy loving kindness." The canon courts were more lenient than the secular courts, and the benefit of the clergy was a popular option for anyone who was literate enough to read or learn the verse by heart. In 1575, the law was changed to mean that the clergy would be tried in the secular courts, but given the option to plead the benefit of the clergy after conviction and before sentencing. Once granted, the benefit did not cancel the conviction, but typically significantly reduced the severity of the sentence. In Jonson's case, from almost certain hanging to a confiscation of goods and branding on the thumb of the right hand. The letter M for manslaughter would have been seared onto Jonson's thumb. The T referred to in the previous quote from the record would have been for thief, and it is assumed that this is just a clerical error. Should he offend again and raise his right hand as he took the oath in court, his previous offence would be obvious to all. The benefit of the clergy could not be claimed more than once. References to the benefit of the clergy recur frequently in Jonson's plays. The whole episode over the death of Gabriel Spencer left deep marks on Jonson, both physically, quite literally, and mentally. But this was his lowest point. Having narrowly escaped the noose, Jonson chose, or was forced, to lie low for a while. It would be understandable if there was something of a reluctance to employ Jonson, killer of a fellow actor, who was a member of the company managed by Henslowe, who had been paying him regularly for plays. That reluctance may be evident in October 1598, when Henslowe records that he paid George Chapman to complete a plot begun by Jonson. Jonson's time in prison, thanks to the Isle of Dogs and the murder of Gabriel Spencer, no doubt gave him time to think. But it also left him in a precarious position. It is, however, also the point at which he began to write poetry, which I'm not going to discuss here, but for the rest of his life, poetry would make up a significant part of his creative output. Perhaps, like Jonson, we should now put the events of his early career, events that left him imprisoned twice and could easily have ended his life, behind us. For sure, Jonson's luck was about to change. Next time, the biography continues, moving towards the most successful period of his career, where Jonson feels the benefits of finally being able to ingratiate himself with the monarch, and which bring him closer to the court than he could ever have imagined. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the cost of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. That's also a great place to get in touch with me if you wish, by using the contact form, or you could even leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.